It was 8:23 p.m. on Wednesday, July 23rd, 1952, when Vincent Vinnie Red Moretti, 38, a mid-level enforcer for the Genovese crime family, stood up in the Palm Cafe on 125th Street in Harlem, pointed at Bumpy Johnson across the table, and said the words that would define the next 90 seconds of his life and haunt him for decades after. The words, a string of racial slurs so vile they cannot be printed in full even today, were delivered loudly enough that everyone in the cafe heard them clearly. All 47 representatives from Harlem's policy operations. All 23 representatives from various Italian mob families. The waitstaff, the security personnel stationed at both entrances. Approximately 200 people total, all of whom fell absolutely silent the instant Moretti finished speaking. What Moretti didn't understand as he stood there, satisfied with himself, confident that he'd humiliated Bumpy Johnson in front of all these witnesses, was that he'd just crossed a line that existed in the criminal world, but that many white mobsters from outside Harlem didn't fully comprehend until too late. There are insults that can be tolerated for strategic reasons. There are provocations that can be ignored in the interest of maintaining peace. And then there are words that demand immediate response, regardless of consequences, regardless of who's watching, regardless of whether responding will cause problems with business relationships. What happened in the next 90 seconds, according to 18 witnesses who were present and who spoke with the Harlem Gazette between July 24th and July 28th, 1952, became the most legendary moment of Bumpy Johnson's career. The moment when silence filled a room crowded with criminals. The moment when a razor appeared and respect was restored. The moment when everyone present learned exactly what lines should never be crossed when dealing with Bumpy Johnson. The meeting at the Palm Cafe on July 23rd, 1952, had been arranged 3 weeks earlier through intermediaries representing both Harlem's independent policy operators and the 5 Italian crime families that controlled much of New York's organized criminal activity. The purpose was straightforward: negotiate territory boundaries to prevent conflicts between Harlem's black-controlled policy gambling operations and the Italian mob's expanding interest in Harlem as a profitable market. Policy gambling, also called the numbers racket, was the primary form of gambling in Harlem in the 1950 seconds. Players would bet small amounts, typically 25 cents to $1, on 3-digit numbers, hoping to match the winning number drawn daily. The odds were approximately 1,000 to 1, which meant the house always won in the long run, but the betting was accessible to working-class people, and payouts could be substantial relative to the small bets involved. By 1952, policy gambling generated approximately $20 million annually in Harlem alone, according to NYPD estimates. That money was split among dozens of independent operators, most of them black entrepreneurs who'd been running policy operations for decades, long before the Italian mob became interested in Harlem's markets. But by the early 1950 seconds, the 5 families, particularly the Genovese family, had begun moving into Harlem, attempting to take over policy operations through various methods ranging from business partnerships to threats and violence. The Italian mob saw Harlem as territory they could conquer, explains Dr. Marcus Thompson, a historian specializing in organized crime in 1950 Seconds, New York. Thompson spoke with Harlem Chronicles during research for this documentary. They dominated organized crime in Manhattan's white neighborhoods for decades. Now they wanted Harlem's lucrative gambling operations, but Harlem's black operators, led by Bumpy Johnson and Stephanie Street, Claire, weren't willing to simply surrender. They'd built these operations themselves. They employed their community. They weren't going to let white mobsters just take over. The July 23rd meeting was supposed to be a diplomatic solution to increasing tensions. Frank Costello, one of the most powerful figures in the Genovese family, had proposed the meeting, suggesting that both sides could benefit from cooperation rather than conflict. Territory would be divided. Profits would be shared according to agreed percentages. Disputes would be resolved through negotiation rather than violence. Bumpy Johnson had agreed to attend, bringing 47 representatives from Harlem's policy operations, including established operators, runners, collectors, and security personnel. The Italian mob brought 23 representatives from the 5 families, including high-level decision-makers who had authority to negotiate binding agreements. The meeting began at 7:30 p.m. and proceeded relatively smoothly for the first 50 minutes. Both sides presented their positions. Territory boundaries were discussed. Profit-sharing percentages were debated. There was tension, there always was when competitors negotiated, but the tension was manageable, controlled, professional. Until Vincent, Vinnie Red, Moretti decided that insulting Bumpy Johnson publicly would be an effective negotiating tactic. Vincent Moretti was not a high-level decision-maker in the Genovese family. He was a mid-level enforcer, someone who'd made his reputation through violence rather than through strategic thinking. He'd been sent to the meeting as part of the Italian mob's delegation, but he didn't have authority to make decisions or to speak for the family. According to multiple witnesses, Moretti had been drinking before the meeting. Not heavily drunk, but enough that his judgment was impaired and his usual restraint was diminished. And at approximately 8:20 p.m., during a discussion about which specific Harlem blocks would fall under Italian control and which would remain with the independent operators, Moretti suddenly stood up and interrupted the negotiation. "This is bullshit," Moretti said loudly, according to witnesses. "We're sitting here negotiating with these people like they're our equals, like they have any right to tell us what we can and can't do in Harlem. This is our city. We run New York. These racial slurs should be grateful we're even talking to them instead of just taking what we want." The room fell silent instantly. Every person present, black and white, high-level and low-level, recognized immediately that Moretti had made a catastrophic error. You could disagree during negotiations. You could argue about territory or percentages, but you didn't use racial slurs. You didn't question someone's right to negotiate, and you absolutely didn't disrespect Bumpy Johnson publicly in a room full of witnesses. The instant Vinnie said those words, everyone knew something terrible was going to happen, says William "Bub" Hewlett, Johnson's chief of security, who was present at the meeting. Hewlett spoke with the Gazette on July 24th, 1952. You could feel the temperature in the room change. The Italian representatives were looking at each other with expressions that said, "Oh God, what did he just do?" The Harlem representatives were looking at Bumpy, waiting to see how he'd respond. And Bumpy just sat there, completely still, staring at Vinnie with this expression that wasn't anger exactly. It was calculation, like Bumpy was deciding in real time what needed to happen next. Moretti, apparently misinterpreting Johnson's silence as weakness or fear, continued talking, adding more insults, more racial slurs, more suggestions that black policy operators had no business negotiating with the Italian mob as equals. "You want to know what I think?" Moretti said, according to witnesses. "I think we should stop pretending these slurs have any power in this negotiation. I think we should tell them how it's going to be. They work for us now. They pay us tribute. They follow our rules. And if they don't like it, we shut them down. That's how this should work. Not this back-and-forth negotiation like they're legitimate businessmen. They're slur, running numbers in a neighborhood we're about to take over. That's all they are." Moretti sat down, apparently satisfied with his speech, apparently believing he'd established dominance, had shown strength, had positioned the Italian mob as the superior party in the negotiation. The room remained absolutely silent. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. All eyes were on Bumpy Johnson, waiting to see what would happen next. For approximately 30 seconds, an eternity in a tense negotiation, Bumpy Johnson sat motionless, staring at Moretti across the table without speaking, without changing expression, giving no indication of what he was thinking or what he intended to do. Then, very slowly, Johnson reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. Everyone in the room knew what was happening, Hulette recalls. Bumpy carried a straight razor in that inside pocket. Everyone who knew Bumpy knew about the razor. It was his signature weapon, the tool he used when he needed to make a point that went beyond words. And the instant Bumpy's hand moved toward that pocket, every Italian representative in the room understood they were about to witness something they'd only heard rumors about. Johnson removed the razor from his pocket, a folded straight razor with a pearl handle, according to witnesses, and placed it on the table in front of him. He didn't open it yet. He just placed it there, clearly visible to everyone in the room, particularly to Moretti, who'd gone pale, suddenly realizing the magnitude of his mistake. "Mr. Moretti," Johnson said quietly, his voice calm but carrying clearly through the silent room, according to multiple witnesses who later described the exchange to the Gazette. "Stand up." Moretti hesitated, looked at his fellow Italian representatives for support or instruction, found none. They were all carefully looking away, making clear through their body language that Moretti was on his own, and slowly stood up. "Come here," Johnson said, his hand resting on the closed razor. Moretti remained motionless for several seconds. The room remained silent, 200 people watching, waiting to see what would happen. Finally, Moretti walked slowly around the table until he was standing approximately 3 feet from Johnson, close enough that Johnson could reach him easily, but far enough that Moretti could theoretically retreat if necessary. "What you just said to me," Johnson said, his voice still calm, still controlled, "was disrespectful. Not just to me personally, but to every person in this room who came here to negotiate in good faith. You questioned my right to sit at this table. You used language that insults my race, my community, my people. You suggested that I should be grateful that you're even willing to talk to me. Is that an accurate summary of what you just said?" I was just..." Moretti stammered. According to witnesses, no longer confident, no longer aggressive, clearly terrified of what might happen next. "I asked you a question," Johnson interrupted, his voice dropping even lower. "Is that an accurate summary of what you just said to me in front of 200 witnesses?" "Yes," Moretti finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Johnson picked up the razor and very slowly opened it, the blade reflecting the overhead lights in the cafe, making clear to everyone present that this wasn't a bluff or a symbolic gesture. This was a weapon, being prepared for use, in front of dozens of witnesses, with full awareness of consequences. "You have a choice to make right now," Johnson said, according to witnesses. "You can apologize to me, sincerely and publicly, in front of everyone in this room. You can acknowledge that what you said was wrong, was disrespectful, was beneath the standards of behavior that should govern negotiations between businessmen. Or you can refuse to apologize, and we'll resolve this matter differently. Your choice. You have 5 seconds to decide." What happened in those 5 seconds, according to every witness present, was one of the most dramatic reversals in the history of organized crime negotiations. Moretti, who minutes earlier had been confidently insulting Johnson and questioning his legitimacy, was now faced with a choice between humiliation and violence, between apologizing publicly or facing consequences with a razor while 200 people watched. Moretti chose survival over pride. "I apologize, Mr. Johnson," Moretti said, his voice shaking, according to witnesses. "What I said was wrong. It was disrespectful. It was beneath the standards that should govern business negotiations. I was out of line. I apologize to you and to everyone in this room." Johnson stared at Moretti for approximately 10 seconds without responding, the opened razor still in his hand, letting the moment extend, making clear through his silence that he was considering whether the apology was sufficient or whether additional response was required. Finally, Johnson closed the razor and placed it back on the table. "Your apology is accepted," Johnson said. "Return to your seat and understand something clearly. If you ever speak to me or about me with that kind of disrespect again, if you ever question my right to negotiate as an equal, if you ever use that language in my presence, I will respond in ways that make tonight look gentle by comparison. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mr. Johnson," Moretti said quickly. "I understand completely." Moretti returned to his seat, moving quickly, clearly eager to end the confrontation. The room remained silent for several more seconds as everyone processed what they'd witnessed. Then Frank Costello, who'd been sitting at the Italian mob side of the table watching the entire exchange without intervening, stood up and addressed the room. "Gentlemen," Costello said, "according to witnesses, what just occurred should serve as a lesson to all of us. Mr. Moretti forgot the basic principle that governs all business negotiations. Respect. We are here to negotiate as equals, as businessmen, as people who understand that cooperation benefits everyone more than conflict does. Mr. Moretti's behavior was unacceptable. His language was inexcusable. Mr. Johnson's response was proportionate and appropriate. We will continue this negotiation with the understanding that everyone at this table deserves and will receive respect." Costello turned to Johnson and extended his hand across the table. "Mr. Johnson, on behalf of the families I represent, I apologize for Mr. Moretti's behavior. It doesn't reflect our values or our approach to business. I hope we can continue our negotiations productively." Johnson stood up and shook Costello's hand. "Apology accepted, Mr. Costello. Let's continue the negotiation." The negotiation continued for another 90 minutes after the confrontation, eventually concluding with an agreement that divided Harlem's policy operations into zones, with certain areas remaining under black operators' control and other areas transitioning to joint operations involving both Harlem operators and the Italian families. But everyone present understood that the real outcome of the July 23rd meeting wasn't the territory agreement. The real outcome was the message Bumpy Johnson had sent through his response to Moretti's insults. What Bumpy did that night established a principle that governed mob relations in Harlem for the next 2 decades, says Theodore Green, Johnson's attorney, who wasn't present at the meeting but who heard detailed accounts from multiple witnesses. The principle was simple. You can negotiate with Bumpy Johnson. You can disagree with him. You can argue about territory or money or strategy, but you will treat him with respect. You will acknowledge his legitimacy as a businessman and as a community leader. You will not use racial slurs or question his right to sit at the table. And if you forget these rules, you'll learn very quickly why they exist. Vincent Moretti's reputation never recovered from the July 23rd incident. According to sources within the Genovese family who spoke anonymously with the Gazette, Moretti was demoted after the meeting, reassigned to low-level collections work rather than enforcement or negotiation duties. His nickname changed from Vinnie Red to Vinnie the Apologizer, a mocking reference to his forced apology in front of 200 witnesses. Vinnie became a cautionary tale within the mob, says one source. New guys coming up would hear the story. Remember what happened to Vinnie Moretti? He disrespected Bumpy Johnson, had to apologize at razor point in front of everyone, and his career never recovered. The story was told to teach people that some men command respect that goes beyond what family they belong to or what position they hold. Bumpy Johnson was one of those men. Moretti left New York entirely in 1954, reportedly moving to Florida, where he worked in legitimate business for the remainder of his life. He never returned to organized crime, never spoke publicly about the July 23rd incident, and died in 1978, still carrying the reputation of the man who'd insulted Bumpy Johnson and lived to regret it. The story of the razor at the Palm Cafe became legendary not just because of the dramatic confrontation, but because of what it revealed about power dynamics in 1,950 seconds organized crime, particularly regarding race. Italian mobsters in the 1,950 seconds generally viewed black criminals as inferior, explains Dr. Thompson. There was an assumption, rooted in racism, that black operators were less sophisticated, less powerful, less legitimate than white mobsters. Italian families thought they could move into Harlem, take over operations, and face minimal resistance because they believed black operators lacked the organization and the courage to fight back effectively. What Bumpy Johnson did on July 23rd shattered that assumption. He demonstrated that black operators in Harlem would demand respect, would defend their dignity, would respond immediately and decisively to insults. He made clear that negotiations would be conducted between equals, not between conquerors and conquered. And he did this in front of 200 witnesses, including representatives from all 5 families, ensuring that the message spread throughout New York's organized crime world. The razor itself became symbolic, a tool that represented both the violence Johnson was capable of and, more importantly, the restraint he demonstrated by not using it when he could have. Johnson could have attacked Moretti immediately after the insults, could have cut him, seriously injured him, made an example of him through bloodshed. Instead, Johnson used the threat of the razor to obtain an apology, to restore respect, to make his point without actually shedding blood in a negotiation setting where violence would have destroyed any chance of productive agreement. The razor showed everyone that Bumpy understood power better than most criminals understood it, says Green. Power isn't about always using maximum violence. Power is about knowing when violence is necessary and when the threat of violence is sufficient. Bumpy got what he needed: an apology, respect restored, a message sent without actually cutting anyone, without destroying the negotiation, without starting a war. That's strategic genius. In the years after July 23, 1952, the story of the razor at the Palm Cafe was told and retold throughout Harlem and throughout New York's organized crime world. Each telling emphasized slightly different details: the number of people present, the exact words spoken, the length of the silence before Moretti apologized, but every version agreed on the essential facts. Bumpy Johnson had been disrespected publicly, had responded with a razor and a demand for apology, and had obtained that apology in front of 200 witnesses. The story became a teaching tool, says Hulett. When new people joined Bumpy's organization, when young criminals started working in Harlem, they'd hear the razor story as part of their education about how things worked in Bumpy's world. The message was, respect matters, dignity matters, and anyone who forgets that will learn very quickly why those things matter. The story also spread beyond criminal circles. Civil rights activists in Harlem heard the story and saw it as evidence that black men could demand respect from white power structures, could refuse to accept disrespect, could fight back when necessary. Ministers referenced the story in sermons as an example of maintaining dignity in the face of insults. Not everyone approved of Bumpy's methods, says Reverend James Mitchell, who knew Johnson and who spoke about him from the pulpit occasionally. He was a criminal. His businesses were illegal. He hurt people. But the razor story resonated with the black community because it showed a black man demanding respect from white mobsters, refusing to accept racial slurs, making it clear that he wouldn't be treated as inferior. In 1952, when black people faced constant disrespect and had few ways to fight back, Bumpy's stand meant something to people who wished they could stand up to their own oppressors. Today, more than 70 years after the Palm Cafe confrontation, the story remains one of the most repeated legends about Bumpy Johnson. Ask elderly residents in Harlem about Bumpy, and many will mention the razor, the silence, the apology forced at blade point. The story endures because it represents something fundamental about Johnson's character and about his approach to power. He understood that respect was more valuable than money, that dignity was worth fighting for, and that sometimes a razor on a table could accomplish more than violence ever could. 200 witnesses watched Vincent Moretti disrespect Bumpy Johnson on July 23, 1952. 200 witnesses watched the razor appear. 200 witnesses watched Moretti apologize. And those 200 witnesses told the story to thousands of others, ensuring that everyone who dealt with Bumpy Johnson understood exactly what lines should never be crossed. That was the meaning of the razor. That was the power of silence. That was the lesson taught in 90 seconds that echoed through decades. Some men earn respect through position or wealth or family connections. Bumpy Johnson earned respect by making clear that disrespect would be met with immediate, decisive response, regardless of consequences, regardless of witnesses, regardless of who was watching. The razor came out. Silence followed. An apology was delivered. And everyone present remembered that moment for the rest of their lives.